Tom is such a wonderful musician, and most Sundays in the year we get to hear him only accompany singing, the singing of the congregation or the singing of the choir. And what a special treat it was just to be reminded, if we didn't know already, what a wonderful musician Tom is, and what a blessing it is to have him here. So thank you, Tom. Now, I suspect that most of us see that there are some problems in the world that need to be solved. And perhaps most of us also experience problems in our own lives for which we are awaiting a solution. Now, if we are Christians, it is probably the case that we hope that God will have some positive role to play in the outworking of these solutions. There are problems that we can see, problems that we experience, and we have a faith that somehow God is mysteriously at work bringing about solutions. And so in some sense, we are a people who are waiting for God to act, waiting for God to fulfill promises, waiting for God to set things right. We're a people waiting for God. Now, what might it mean for us to be a people who are waiting for God? The comedian Bill Cosby has a joke he sometimes uses in his stand-up comedy routines. He says, there are too many people waiting for Jesus to come along and cut their grass. But Jesus isn't going to come along and cut your grass. There's a wonderful British TV show. It's not being made anymore, but it's still in reruns. It's called Waiting for God. It's about the senior citizens who live in a retirement home. In fact, they live in the Bayview Retirement Home in Bournemouth. It's a wonderful show. And think of the title, Waiting for God, as if they're waiting idly for God to take them home. Our Bible story from the Gospel of Luke this morning told of a man in the time of Jesus who lived in Jerusalem named Simeon. And Luke tells us that he was waiting for God. Jesus was a little baby, just a few weeks old, and his parents, Mary and Joseph, took him to Jerusalem and to the temple to do what was often done for young babies in that time, which was to dedicate him to God, to dedicate his life and his being, to give him over to the purposes and to the service of God. And at that time, there was a man living there named Simeon. Luke tells us that Simeon was a good and a righteous man, which I think means that he was good in the things he did outwardly, and also that his heart and his will was good and kind and loving and faithful, and therefore the good things that he did were matched by a goodness of spirit. Now, somehow God had told Simeon that before he died, he would see the Messiah that God had promised. And Luke says that he was one waiting expectantly for the comforting of Israel. The great biblical scholar in the last century, George Caird, reminded us that this language of the comforting of Israel was a common reference to the coming Messianic age, the day when God would fulfill the promises that had been made to God's people, Israel. And Simeon felt a tug in his heart to go to the temple one day. And his arrival at the temple coincided with that of Mary and Joseph bringing the baby Jesus. And somehow in faith, when Simeon saw the baby Jesus, he knew that God's promises to him, and in fact God's promises to the people of Israel, had come true. In that very moment, what he had been waiting for all his life had happened. He had seen the Messiah, the one whom God had sent. And he prayed aloud in joy, "Now, O God, you can dismiss your servant, because my eyes have seen your salvation." Now, I think there are at least three things that Luke wants us to see in this not-so-chance encounter. The first one is that for Christians, Jesus is the Messiah. Now, that doesn't mean that Jesus is the Messiah only for Christians, but that for Christians, Jesus is the Messiah. What does that mean? Messiah is basically a Hebrew word which means anointing. And in the time of ancient Israel, people were selected or chosen for a role by the symbolic anointing of oil. Some oil would be put on one's head to acknowledge that he or she had an important role. And so we might understand the word Messiah not just as anointed, but as being chosen. And that the Messiah, therefore, is the one whom God has chosen. In fact, the one whom God has chosen to do a very specific and important thing, a very unique thing, which in fact, perhaps no one else was able to do. Quite a few years ago now, thankfully, I was in graduate school at Emmanuel College at the University of Toronto. And I was writing a thesis on the history of the Presbyterian churches in my hometown of Galt, Ontario, which is now part of Cambridge. And the city of Galt, or a village, I suppose, as it first began, was settled by Scottish people who were Presbyterians in the 1820s. And because there was this flood of Scottish immigrants who were coming to this city, the church in Scotland sent over ministers who would minister to the population of this new settlement. And one of these ministers that was sent over from Scotland was named John Bain, and he was by far the most successful of those who came to Canada at that time. His church grew to be very large, one of the largest churches in the new country of Canada. And in fact, under his leadership, that church planted all kinds of other churches in the area. Now, a friend of John Bain's wrote a biography of him. And his friend noted that he had always had the dream of going back to his home in Scotland. At many points in his working career here in Canada, he would try to get a position back in Scotland so he could go home. And for one reason or another, his efforts always failed. Now, it's not important for you to know who John Bain was, but it is beautiful to see how his friend who wrote this biography interpreted his situation. He asked a question: why was he not able to return home to Scotland? And his friend's answer was, because God had given him to Canada. What a wonderful thing that might be said about someone. That God has given him or her to such an important purpose, that God has set aside someone's life and someone's gifts to something important. God has given all of us to something. God has given us to our friends and to our family members and perhaps to our work, perhaps to some form of Christian service that we exercise in a church. God gave Jesus for something. In fact, God chose him for something so important that the Bible tells us no one else was able to do what Jesus did. And that is why, for Christians, he is thought of and believed in as the Messiah. Another thing that Luke wants us to see in this story is the purpose of God calling a people into being, and therefore a purpose for God choosing a Messiah. You see, God created the whole world, and God wanted to be in a relationship with everyone. God's presence longs to fill all the earth. And the Bible tells us that the way God went about achieving these purposes was by, first of all, creating a relationship with one person named Abraham. And then with all of Abraham's family, and finally with the nation that was descended from him, Israel. And God created these relationships not so that these people would be more important or powerful than others, but so that they could serve others. God called them not to be served, but to serve, to be a light to the nations, to make God and God's love known to everyone. And insofar as they were not able to do that, God sent a chosen one, Jesus, who was to be the true light, the light of the world. I think the 1960s is probably one of the most important decades in the history of our entire Western civilization, going back for centuries. I think many of us have the experience that our society is changing very rapidly in our own day and age. And my opinion is that because of the changes that happened in the 1960s, which are now becoming the new normal for everyone, it appears that our society is only just now changing in radical ways. This was especially interesting in how it has affected Christianity and the Roman Catholic Church in particular. Some of you who grew up as Roman Catholics may remember that prior to the 1960s, much of the church service happened in Latin, and at half the time the priest did it with his back to the congregation. And the Catholic Church realized in the 1960s that this was just not going to work anymore. People were not going to come to a church service in an ancient language where the leader of the service had his back to everyone. And so the Pope at the time, John the 23rd, called all the Catholic bishops from around the world and convened a meeting which was known as the Second Vatican Council. And many people consider this to be the most important religious event of the 20th century. And the Catholic bishops who got together wrote many reports. And the most famous of the reports they wrote is known by the Latin title Lumen Gentium, which comes from the very first line of the report, which says, "Christ is the light of the nations." That was the purpose for which God chose Jesus, to be the light of the world, to show the light of God's love to everyone. What's perhaps even more interesting about that document, Lumen Gentium, is that it is about the church. It is about the community of Jesus' followers around the world. As Jesus is the light to the nations, so are his people to share his light around the world. I think perhaps the third thing that Luke wants us to see in this story is that an important identifying mark of God's people who are casting the light of God's love around the world is that these are people who are waiting for God. People who are waiting in the tension of both patience and hopeful expectation for God to do what God has promised in our world. This kind of waiting is not doing nothing. What this waiting is living and acting in the present according to how the future is expected to be. For example, when Melissa and I got married, a number of people just gave us a card with some cash inside as a gift. Rather than giving us a blender or a crock pot or a set of dishes, people would put cash in a card, and that's a very common thing. Now, at that time, we didn't own a house, and we already had cars, and we didn't have a very expensive wedding, and so we didn't owe any money, and so we didn't really need the money that people had given us immediately. And so we decided to put it away, to save it, and to invest it for the future. Now, we got married just a few weeks after the economy crashed in the fall of 2008. And energy prices hit the floor. And I was convinced that prices for energy would never again be lower than they were then, and they could only go up. And so I took the money that we had been given for our wedding, and I bought some shares in some oil and gas companies because I thought they would be higher in the future than they were in the present. I was acting in the present in anticipation of what I expected the future to hold. This is the kind of waiting that God's people do. This is the kind of waiting that Simeon did. Simeon acted in the present according to how he expected God to make the world in the future. Simeon acted with love and with faith because he knew that someday in the will and the grace and the power of God that those things would rule in the world. He waited with hopeful expectation for God to fulfill the promises which had been made to God's people and by extension to everyone. And what were those promises, you ask? Well, those promises were none other than to fix the problems of the world and to fix each of us as individuals. In other words, for God to set the world right, for God to restore creation to the original purposes for which it had been made. Simeon lived every day of his life just like you and I did. He put his pants on one leg at a time. But in everything he did, he lived with the hopeful expectation that God's promises would come true, and he acted accordingly. In the church that my family attended when I was a teenager, there was an elderly woman named Aileen McKellar. And in the time that I knew her, she was quite old and frail. And a number of times in our church service, she would have a little bit of a fainting spell, if you know what I mean. And then there was this one day, maybe it was a day quite like today, a little hot and muggy. And right there in the pew, in the middle of the church service, Aileen McKellar just about keeled over. Just went from sitting up to bang, right on the pew. And I'll never forget, there was this middle-aged gentleman who came to our church with his family, and I don't think that he was particularly interested in church because he never stood up to sing the hymns. And I remember when Aileen McKellar went over, he darted into action because all of a sudden he had a purpose for being in our church on a Sunday morning. And I thought, and I think that most of the people in our church that day thought that she had died because she had passed out so many times, and this time was so dramatic, and she was out cold. As it turned out, she did not die. We called the ambulance, and she was taken to hospital, and she was fine, relatively. And I was talking about this to my dad one time, and I thought, well, she could have died, and we thought maybe she even had died right there in that moment. And my dad said, Aileen McKellar would be happy to die. She would be happy to die. What a wonderful thing that is to say about someone. That she had lived her whole life with a wonderfully deep faith in God. That she knew she'd had a good life. And she knew that she was going to die, and that when she died, her family would be looked after and the world would go on. And she knew that even when she died, she would go to be with God as her husband had already gone. And she was at a place of wonderful peace and contentment about what the future held. She would be happy to die. Wouldn't it be something for all of us if we didn't have to worry about the future? If we could be just happy knowing that everything is in God's hands. God's people are those who wait with hope and expectation for God to act, for God to fulfill the wonderful promises that have been made to us, that we are being set right, and so is our world, and that one day God's work will be finished. And so we wait with hopeful expectation. It's not the kind of waiting where we think Jesus is going to come along and cut our grass. It's the kind of waiting where we live now in anticipation of the fulfillment of God's promises. I think of those wonderful characters in the British TV show Waiting for God. They aren't sitting idly in their rocking chairs. They're making the most of every day. Simeon, too, in the Gospel of Luke, was not idly wasting his days away. He was making the most of the time that God had given him. We too, when we wait for God, are genuinely making the most of our lives. For I think waiting for God is another way of saying that we simply walk one step at a time along the path that God has set for us, with confidence that we will get to the destination that God has laid there and is ready for us. God's people are those who are waiting with hope and expectation for God. And it means that we're willing to take just that one step, not worrying so much about the destination or what lies at the end, but knowing that at our next step, and then the next, and then the next, that God will be with us, and that God will be guiding us at each step along the way. Jesse Jackson, the American civil rights leader, he has said poignantly what I'm sure has been said many times before. If you don't know exactly what tomorrow holds, you need to know who holds tomorrow. And friends, it is our living, loving, and everlasting God, our Maker, who holds us and holds our world and holds tomorrow.